Welcome, everyone. This is the benefits of fear, conflict, failure, and resistance. All really good things if we have a healthy relationship with them. This is part of the series from Co-Creative on Collaborative Innovation Essentials, where we share different elements of an approach to collaboration toward changing the fundamental dynamics of systems that we're all a part of and we're all impacted by. This is a little bit different webinar than we often do. Many times our webinars are things that we've done training on and we want to share them and offer them to other folks who are leading systems change work, who are leading collaborations, etc. This particular webinar is the result of a hobby that I have, and I'll tell you a little story as we get started here about that hobby and where this webinar came from. But this webinar is more experimental and exploratory. So we're going to ask you to explore and experiment with us in this webinar. And I'm going to share some of what I've collected, and we're going to work together to kind of flesh out our common understanding of how we can benefit from these things that are often cast as negative experiences. So my name is Russ Gaskin. I'm with Co-Creative, and I want to run over a few things before we get started. The first is you'll receive an email soon in the next day or so with a recording of today's webinar. And you'll also receive a copy of the slides. And if we mention certain resources or links, we will provide those in that email as well. We encourage you, if you have any technical issues, to use the Zoom chat. Melissa, who's on our team, will help with technical difficulties as we're able to do remotely. Another thing is, please don't worry about children, pets, other animals who may not be pets of yours, dirty laundry, maybe pictures that you didn't want people to see. Whatever those things are that are in your life and your background, we welcome all of that. So we're showing up as real people in real life in a real pandemic, and let's all just be welcoming of all that difference among us. We're also going to today be using an interactive meeting technology called Slido. I think it will be pretty straightforward in terms of how to use that, but that's going to enable us to collectively kind of share our thinking in a way that doesn't require us to all line up and speak one at a time, so we can kind of share and think concurrently. So when you get to the Slido polling portion of this session, if you have, again, any technical difficulties with accessing that, please send a chat message to Melissa Darnell, whom you'll find in the participants list. Okay, so Melissa.
Yeah, thanks, Russ. So I'm so happy to see everybody today. Briefly, I also work with Co-Creative. I help to manage our training program through recruitment, planning, and delivery. And I also have the opportunity and the privilege to work on some stakeholder research and other special projects. So I'm really excited that you're all here today. I want to start off by sharing again that Slido is, if you haven't seen it yet, we're going to do it right now. It's super fun. And so either in your web browser or on your mobile device, if you have that handy next to you, we would like you to go to slido.com. And I think there might be a slide that we could advance that is going to have some of this up on it. Slido.com. This is where we're just gonna about finding out who is with us in the room today. And so
maybe reactivate the poll, Melissa.
Yeah, sure thing. So we'll go to slido.com, and I'm going to ask you to put in a tag. You can see that it says "Yay Failure" right there. Yay failure is where you'll have access to the survey that we are going to be working on during today's session. And it's going to populate with 4 questions that we are going to invite you to add your particular responses to. The first one is your name and your organization, so we can figure out who is with us today. You should be able to, once you have accessed the survey, tell us where you're joining from today. And we're also going to ask you to give us one word that is a value that consistently shows up in your work. The code, which is on the shared screen, is YAY failure, Y-A-Y failure. And then finally,
there'll be one more prompt. Yep.
Yep. Finally, you'll see we'll be prompted to. I've asked which of the 4 baddies was what drew you here most today. If you could choose one between fear, conflict, failure, and resistance. And we'll just give everybody an opportunity to get in there. Again, let me know if you are having any trouble accessing. The code is YAY failure, Y-A-Y failure, all one word. It's not case sensitive. Okay, so as you can see on the screen now, we're starting to pop the answers that you are submitting are coming in. So now we're looking at who is here and what organization. Dan Ferguson is here. We have David, some folks from KINS Innovative Networks. Molly Jackson is here. Hello, Molly. The AIDS Resource Foundation from Children. Luis, thank you for being here. Stephanie is here from Montana. Ruby is here from Latino Outdoors, which is an organization based here in California where I am. Epic Ohana, Hawaii is represented here today. Will is here, thank you, Will. And while some of these organizations are familiar to me, and I know where folks are from, or you've added it to your lines right there, let's take a peek at the geographic representation, where folks are joining from today. So wow, somebody joining us from India, Portland, Oregon, Minneapolis, Humboldt County, Montana, Canada, Maryland.
So from Hilo, is that Kamaile? Aloha?
I'm not sure, but we have some folks from across the pond in the UK that are here today. Also some Canadian colleagues, Ontario, lots of time zones represented. So we really appreciate you all taking the time to join us. Alexandria, Virginia. Looks like Massachusetts, some friends from Arcata. And here's what you all have said about what consistently guides your work. I'm having an emotional reaction to seeing this word cloud because it's so beautiful. Integrity, justice, collaboration, equity, inclusion, generosity. It feels really powerful to me to be able to share space with you all. Finally, oh, this is really interesting. So resistance, 41% of folks. So we'll dig in deeply to more of that later on in the session. Fear is also coming up, conflict, and less fun failure, 13%. Okay. Ooh, some folks are changing their answers in live time. That's awesome. Okay, and we can send a summary of all of these things out when I email you with the recording of the session too, and so that you also can have these answers to reflect on in your practice later this week.
All right, so this is a little bit about who Co-Creative is, and you can obviously find out more on our website. So I won't spend too much time on that. And so I wanted to share some context, but I wanted to start with a little bit of background. Some of you may have just joined after I shared that this is a more experimental, not collaborative, but a more kind of experimental mutual exploration kind of webinar than we've sometimes done. And it started as a hobby. And the hobby of mine started when a number of years ago, I read an article about a young person who felt no pain. And I don't know if you've read about this condition, but there's a rare condition that a small group of people on this planet have, where the pain receptors in their brain are blocked and they're unable to feel physical pain. And I was reading this and I thought, well, this is kind of interesting, and kind of imagining what might that be like to not feel any pain. That's kind of intriguing, right? And I was trying it on and just kind of had a kind of intellectual curiosity about this until I got to the point in the article where I read that this young boy had broken his leg and didn't realize it until he was walking along and his leg snapped and his bones tore through his skin. And then I realized how horrible it would be to have a life where I couldn't feel physical pain, and just how important pain is in protecting us and helping us to survive and thrive. And that reframing started to extend to these other things that I was noticing we tend to characterize as bad or negative, or things that we really disfavor or prefer not to have in our lives. Things like failure or conflict, maybe, or fear. And so I started a hobby. I'm kind of a collector, and I collect crazy things like polarities and stuff like that. But I started collecting the good things about these things that people maybe thought were bad. And started a document, and I would throw things in there every once in a while. Sometimes we would see how failure really helped a group learn something that was really critical to their work, and actually led to some breakthroughs in their thinking and their strategy. I noticed how fear could be really powerful, and we'll share a quote. I don't know if Jen is on, Jen Hamady, but I'll share a quote from Jen a bit later that contributed to this kind of rethinking these things that I'd often thought I didn't want to have in my life. So today we want to kind of work together to develop our collective awareness and knowledge about these things. So I'm going to share with you my collection, and I'm interested to see what you might add to that collection, maybe what stands out to you about that collection, etc. The other thing is, Melissa noted this as we were prepping for this, that we're talking about these as kind of separate things. There's fear, then there's conflict, and then failure and resistance. But there are a lot of relationships among these things. So a lot of conflict that I feel sometimes with another person or in a group is based in fear. And resistance can be based in fear. Resistance can be based in my past experiences with failure, for example. So we'll talk a little bit about the interplay and the commonalities among these things as well. The other is that, of course, these things are very culturally relative, particularly conflict. And so when we're talking about the bad things or the baddies or whatever, we were talking to different people about different aspects of fear, conflict, failure, etc. And so we recognize there are really diverse orientations toward these things based on cultural and personal valences. And the other thing is we're only sharing a part of the picture about this, and this isn't about all forms of fear or all sources of conflict. And I think there might be some parsing out there, because we're not talking about having an unhealthy relationship with fear when you're about to be attacked in the jungle by a Siberian tiger. You know, there's kind of physical threat, there's social threat, there's a lot of good work on social threats based on the SCARF model and research that's been done around that. But we're not claiming that this is the whole picture or all of what we can learn or say or understand about these topics. So we want to start with some quick kind of just level setting and share some working definitions and just see, are these good enough? Maybe hear from a few people. If you have some other definitions, if you wouldn't mind dropping those into the chat, that will be helpful enriching our collective understanding of what these things are. For today, what we're proposing around fear is something simple like an emotion that arises when we believe someone or something is threatening or likely to cause us pain or embarrassment. So if you have reflections on that, feel free to drop them into the chat. But that's kind of, for now, what we're using as a working definition. Fear is also energy. And I think that's a theme that we've seen across all four of these. Fear can be a forecast. So it's a projection often into the future of something that is going to happen or may happen, but hasn't yet happened. It can also be a signal from the past. So my past experiences are informing me that there might be a threat here. Whether or not there is, I see enough similarities in the current situation to a past situation where something bad happened. And it can also be a source of insight. And Melissa, if there's anything that you want to call out or invite someone to share more on, I'm unable to see the chat on my current.
Yeah, so people are adding all sorts of really interesting and dynamic nuances to this definition. That fear of shame, or that shame is also connected to fear, vulnerability, lack of trust, irritation or annoyance, the fear of uncertainty or the unknown.
Great.
Is coming up. And also, we want Jessica to know that we love her cat.
So conflict, this is from Edwin Nevis, who is a Gestalt therapist and applied, one of the pioneers in applying Gestalt therapy to group work and in organizations. And so he has a very interesting definition here of conflict being two different worldviews or perceptions of reality occupying the same place at the same time. And conflict is also the assumption that those worldviews are mutually exclusive. So in our work with polarity thinking, for example, we find that not only are they not mutually exclusive often, but those perceptions can be interdependent with each other. Conflict is often based in a frame of winning and losing. It is also a source of insight. And I would add, it's also energy. Often if I'm in conflict with you, that means I have some stake, that at some level I care about something that's involved in the conflict. Resistance, we've defined very simply here as a way of protecting and managing boundaries. It can also be interest. I wouldn't be resisting if I didn't have some interest or energy around what's happening. I would just disengage. And so resistance can also mean engagement. It can also be a source of insight. And by the way, we're going to capture what was shared in the chat too and share that out. I hope no one is claiming copyright on your material there, but if so, we'll, yeah.
Russ, before you move on, there's just some things that, in case other folks are not able to see the chat too, I really want to lift up. Related to conflict, people are saying that there's disconnection from expectations, that it's perception based, that conflict is a signal that people care enough to engage with you, that it can be internal and then projected externally. So just really good and enriching contributions that are happening in chat. And I want to reaffirm, yeah, that we'll make sure that all of this goes out to folks.
Great. And obviously we'll see similar things with conflict and with resistance. Often the difference being the power differentials that exist in the relationship. And then failure, we've tried to keep all these kind of simple. What we call it when you don't get the outcome you expected. So one of my teachers, John Carter at the Gestalt OSD Center, just says, well, that's a fail. And the fail is simply, you expected one thing and you got another. Failure is also a type of disruption, can be a reorientation, can also be a source of insight. So we would like to invite you to work together here, and we're going to create some breakout groups, 4 breakout groups, and each person will have a facilitator. I'm going to ask the facilitators to introduce yourselves quickly in a minute here while Melissa's setting up the rooms. And on each of these topics, fear, conflict, failure, and resistance, we have a slide, and on that slide, it has a couple of prompts. The first is, this happens when, so I have an unhealthy relationship with fear when something's happening, and you'll see some examples in there. Or often I have, when an unhealthy relationship with conflict shows up, it shows up in this kind of situation. And then when I have an unhealthy relationship with conflict, the resulting impact on us or on me is. So on each of these, you'll see we've put a couple of prompts in there, but we wanted to get a sense of what we're thinking about how these things get triggered, these unhealthy dynamics around fear, conflict, failure, and resistance, and then what some of the impacts or implications are. So you'll see we're going to have each facilitator host your breakout group and work on a slide. So group 1 will be working on fear, and your slide is slide number 12, and then you can see the others here for conflict, resistance, and failure. Melissa, are we good to go on breakouts?
Actually, Russ, I don't have the ability to do that from the way that I'm participating.
Okay. So maybe we're not going to do that unless I can do it super fast here.
Russ, you could try and make her a host too, I think.
Yeah.
And she could do it.
I think I'll just try to do this really quickly.
Justine just sent you encouragement via chat. You can do
thank
it, Russ.
you, Justine.
It's not the outcome you expected, says Dan.
Yeah, that was a fail. I think let's do this another way. I'm going to go through the slides, and as we share those, let's hear from folks. And what I'll do is, how do I make Melissa my co-host here?
Go to participants and then find Melissa, and then it'll say co-host.
Yeah, it doesn't have co-host as an option. Okay. All right, so
Does it have more as an option because it might be there?
it does, but it says make host, and unfortunately I'm the one who's sharing the Slido polls and the presentation. So let's take this as a fail, and we're going to learn from it. And I'm going to go back and share the screen, and we're going to move forward. Okay. So let's do this very dynamically. Have maybe one of our team can go into the document and capture what people are sharing. And so unmute yourself if you have something to share it, and then we'll hear from a few people on each of these. So when we have an unhealthy relationship with fear, this happens when we try to repress or ignore the fear. We feel overwhelmed or ungrounded. So what are some other times when we can get, or situations where we can get into an unhealthy relationship with fear?
Too much thinking about the future.
Mm-hmm.
That sounds like Fran Boyd.
Yeah, it is. Hi, Russ. Great to hear you.
Thank you. Others?
I think overthinking the consequences, and so it paralyzes us in making any decision.
Thanks, Cardina. Others?
Mine's related to your first one. I think it becomes undiscussable in groups. You can't talk about the fear.
So that's how it often will play out at a group level, right?
Mm-hmm.
And maybe individual too, right?
Maybe individually, often, both, I think.
Mm-hmm.
I think when we don't acknowledge or recognize that it's in our body and kind of work with moving it out of our bodies or through our bodies.
Sally, the comment that you were sharing made me think that, you know, in a group context, when people are afraid to give voice to a fear, it might be because they're associating that with their entire identity rather than just this one particular instance and this one issue that needs to be talked about.
Right.
So when this is happening, when we get into this unhealthy relationship with fear, we see things like maybe we shut down. I know with myself, my range of options or my range of choice narrows dramatically. So rather than seeing lots of options, I see one or two, and they both seem to be bad somehow. What are the other impacts we might see or experience with an unhealthy relationship with fear?
We look for an enemy or an adversary.
Mm-hmm.
I think maybe assuming we're the only one, so we don't open ourselves up to being a little vulnerable about it.
Mm-hmm.
I think physiological too, right? Sweaty palms, roiling stomach, those things that it really makes the somatic relationship so clear between body and mind.
Yeah.
That's good.
For me, there's a buzzing in my head, with my head coming up with all the crazy things that could possibly happen.
Russ, this is Carrie from Portland, and I as someone who has had a relationship, someone who's been involved in violence-based relationships, I think it's important to note that, like, part of what I hear us talking about is when we have control of our responses related to fear, and some of our fear is, and how we respond is actually dependent on our external environments and whether safety becomes a concern when we're able to respond to fear or not. And so there's a little bit of privilege around saying we have control to develop coping mechanisms to move us into a healthy relationship with fear if there are literal physical and emotional abuse consequences associated with responding to fear. So I kind of feel like there's a spectrum of fear, and our ability to respond is not a one size fits all based on our own personal safety.
Yeah. And we're not necessarily focusing here on choice or responses, but you know, these impacts. Let's hear one more impact. Thank you, Carrie. And we'll get to some of that choice stuff too, and maybe share more at that point, Carrie, too.
I can respond to the impact question. I was presenting a personal argument in a court case, and fear came up for me, and I labeled it as bad. And all of a sudden I had this insight, well, maybe this is just really important to you. And the sense of fear being bad is really just a sense that this is, hey, really important. And so by not labeling fear as bad, but just seeing it as, wow, there's something big and important here, I was able to shift it and allow it to be a motivation to be really effective in court.
So, and this goes to Carrie's point too, where we have choice and we have room to move. As we are able to develop a healthy relationship with fear, it can offer a range of benefits. So, if you have other suggestions for this, please drop them into the chat, and we can add them into the slide deck here before we share it. This is just what I've been collecting over the years from both my own experiences and observations in the collaborations that we've been supporting. Carrie, is there more you might add? Because I'm wondering about that, right? That kind of like the role of privilege and power dynamics as it relates to our ability to develop this healthy relationship with fear.
Well, I think the reason it's come up for me is because I just got off an hour-long call about the relationship between being in an organization that has had consistent change over the last 2 years, that has built a little bit of a feeling of collective trauma around staff. And then you put a global pandemic on top of that. And we were talking about how to have kind of a conversation with employees related to our relationship with change and fear, and how do we deal with our feelings around those things when a lot of us have different experiences with trauma and how we respond. And so it's kind of an interesting follow-up to that call, because we just talked about the value of choice and how some folks in our workplace have diagnosed PTSD. And so their literal ability to get out of a depressive place, to cope with the fear that comes from leading or working in a pandemic, just to talk, just to say I need help is a huge thing for them. And so I don't know, I'm kind of reflecting about about that when people are in that deeper place with a diagnosed condition where fight and flight comes very quickly. And we talked about the 3 R's related to sort of dealing with trauma, which is how do we move to a place of being relational with people to provide some mutual connection and relationship that then allows us to move to reason, and then reason gets us in that place where we can have a healthy relationship with fear. So I think it's like in learning, fear can build authentic, meaningful relationships among people if we're able to talk about it in that context. That's just the first thought without reflecting.
And it reminds me of fear and depression are very different, but when I was experiencing severe depression, going to what you were saying, Carrie, what I could do was to talk myself out of bed. That's all I mean, I felt like I had a 2-ton weight on my chest. And I had to say, you're sitting up. You're turning to the side of the bed. You're putting your feet on the ground. Like that's what I could do at that point.
Right. The
So,
fear is almost in something that exacerbates depression.
yeah. So these are some things that, because obviously I haven't wanted to collect just kind of the experience of fear and the benefit of fear, but I've been collecting some things around how we can develop healthy relationships with fear. And one of the interesting ones that many of you have probably heard of is to catastrophize, and to go into the fear and basically fully express the worst absolute thing that could happen. And sometimes it is bad, but now we're fully experiencing just how bad the situation is, and we're fully present to it, and then more present to what we might need to do in that situation. Or often the result of catastrophizing is, wow, it's not really that bad, right? Depends on the situation. So these will be in the document. This, I think, is a kind of beautiful thing around unknowing and kind of recognizing our place in life and the universe. From A.R. Amen's, this says, our existence is evidence of more than we can imagine. Much we can't see is working right. Let's celebrate that part of our ignorance. And I put the eggs nest here because a friend of mine, Joshua Humphreys at Croatan Institute, posted some eggs in a nest, and he said, take comfort in the fact that nature doesn't care about your fear. So these are some the practices kind of set into the chakras. So we might do things around spiritual service or our spiritual practice. Experiences of awe, wonder, and gratitude can all help shift our relationship with fear. As we get into the head here, rational emotive practices, general semantics practices, which we can share if folks are interested. We get into the heart area, the heart chakra meditation from Sufism, empathy, particularly experiences of empathy with others, and then reconnecting with our support system, and then grounding or creating space within our bodies, grounding physical activities, these things in the lower chakra, or in Hawaiian culture, for Native Hawaiians, connecting to Aina, the earth. So this is another view on that, which is based on some recent conversations with Melanie Goodchild at the Turtle Island Institute, who's doing a lot of work to integrate indigenous wisdom, traditions, and practices with systems thinking. And so these are the same as the 4 or 7 chakras that I just shared, but now placed on a medicine wheel. And the idea in Anishinaabe health isn't the absence of disease, it's the presence of balance. And so Melanie talks really beautifully about the idea of it to really become healthy and develop healthy relationships, for example, with fear, we can rebalance these directions. And so for me, what this means is I will often go to my head. As I said, when I'm afraid, my head buzzes with lots of terrible possibilities of things that can happen. And so for me, getting into my body is a really powerful intervention, or moving into my emotions is a really powerful act. So it's a part of me that I've been neglecting And so moving out of where I'd normally operate into these other parts of myself is really helpful to me. So I wanted to invite Bob Dickman. Bob, you must be somewhere in this list.
Yeah, I'm here.
All right. Bob is a coach who had a transformational impact on my life. Bob specializes in the power of storytelling and narrative, in change and transformation and growth and development. And Bob was also a person who helped me connect with some other parts of myself. So Bob is going to share with us an exercise around fear. I think that's what Bob's going to do.
Yeah, sure. So what I'd like us to do collectively is to get more body-centric, to get centered in our own experience in our own bodies. And I'd like to work with different elements. And the first one is warmth. You can keep your eyes open or closed. It's up to you, whatever you feel most comfortable in as I lead you through these elements. So warmth, where in your body do you feel warmth? Where in your body do you feel coolness, cold? Going back to the warmth. Where is it concentrated? In many wisdom traditions, we speak about the Hara Dantian cough, all indicating about 3 finger widths below your navel. Exploring, can you drop your energy, your awareness down into your abdomen, into your belly? And take slow, deep breaths to see if you can, like a bellows, blowing oxygen onto the fire. Can you feel warmth? Can you feel that spreading throughout your body? Inhaling and exhaling. The next element I'd like to work with is earth. What in your body feels solid? Your spine? Can you feel your feet on the ground? What do you sense the bottom of your feet? Can you sense the earth below your feet? Can this experience help ground you in the present moment? Where in your body do you feel water, liquid, flowing? Can you feel the blood moving through your hands? Can you feel the beat of your heart? Can you sense that all of your body is alive and connected? What are you aware of in your body? What do you experience as you allow yourself to increase your awareness of your body. If you're aware that you need to shift or move in some way to seek more comfort, allow yourself to please do that. Now, gently open your eyes if they're not already open, and look around the room and notice things. Really not just move your eyes, but move your head to the left and to the right slowly. And what do you notice that you hadn't seen before? What are you aware of that you hadn't noticed before? In your body, is there anything you're discovering now that your awareness is drawn to? Feel free to explore that. What has changed in your body? What has changed in the room since we began this exploration? Going back to the breath, going back to the abdomen. Has anything shifted in your awareness from a few moments ago to where you are now? Pay attention to anything that's changing or has changed or change, both in your body and outside your body. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you, Bob. I'm feeling more integrated. I realized there were parts of myself that were in the webinar and parts of myself that were somewhere else.
Yeah.
So I noticed in the chat there were some questions related to semantics and somatics. So somatic work, somatic experience is really helpful. We just experienced some form of that in a way, but if you're interested in somatics, which is how we pay attention to, how we are aware of, how we learn from our bodies, and how we're able to use our bodies more effectively in leadership and work. A good source for that is the Strozzi Institute, and we'll include that in the resources. General semantics is a field that deals with how we make meaning and relate to reality. And so we can also share some practices from general semantics. So for example, one of them is called indexing, which is being sure that we differentiate between things that we tend to categorize together. And so, or dating, which is making sure that when we talk about some knowledge or fact that we put a date on it, because information and learning and awareness is always changing. So we could share some things about that as well. I'll move a little bit quicker here. Let's hear from a few folks about what happens when we have an unhealthy relationship with conflict. Feel free to also put things into chat, but let's hear from some folks verbally.
I feel like we miss the opportunity for relationships and that vulnerability that sometimes comes with conflict. We feel like it's a negative thing to be in conflict when it can really, for me, it's been improving my relationships if I face conflict with folks.
Yeah. And so that can be an outcome, right? And but if we frame it as a negative thing, that's where we won't get that outcome potentially.
We withdraw.
You withdraw.
Yeah.
Others?
Immediately acquiesce.
Yeah, some of us will avoid, some of us will compete and assert or double down, right? We'll talk about, one of the resources we'll mention is the conflict mode inventory. Thomas Kilmann conflict mode inventory. When else do we get into an unhealthy relationship with conflict?
When the ego is present a lot.
Like, I have to win?
Yeah.
I think we can get into an unhealthy relationship with conflict when something seems small and we don't bring something up because that thing, especially if it's a conflict with someone that you are in a relationship with or have a deep friendship with or work with regularly, that can then become a repeat instance that bubbles and builds from something really simple to something more complicated and more difficult to address.
This also happens when we're projecting intentions onto the other person. And so we believe that this person is doing this thing because he or she wants to hurt us, or they don't like us or whatever, right? And so there can be both forecasting of the future as well as projection of intentions or imagining intentions. So some of the benefits that I've kind of captured over the years. Conflict can build self and other awareness. It can shift our and others' boundaries. And obviously as a benefit there, I'm talking about shifting boundaries in a healthy way, not an unhealthy way. Can increase our adaptability and flexibility. So one of the things we see in political polarization in the US and other countries is mobility. People are able to move to communities where there are more people who think like they do, and we're able to kind of form tribes online with people who reinforce our own perceptions and biases and et cetera. And so we're rubbing up less against difference and experiencing less conflict. And so we have less kind of facility with conflict, how we experience it, how we manage it, how we leverage it, et cetera. So we have some more suggestions here around healthy relationships with conflict. And there's a little bit of an order here because in reviewing the practices around developing healthy relationships with fear, it seemed that many of those apply to conflict as well. And in addition, you see the old adage, count to 10. We often talk about in our work the need to differentiate before we integrate. So let's really understand the diverse needs and interests, priorities, values, et cetera, before we try to get people to agree on things or align on things. And then we have a resource on what is it like to work from interests rather than positions. And below interests, how can we work at a deeper level at values? So getting away from this is what I think needs to happen to this is my interest to, well, I have a real value around whatever it is, accountability or responsibility or whatever. So I mentioned the Thomas Kilmann conflict mode inventory. That's a really terrific resource. People can use it individually. You can also use it in groups, and it's really helpful to see how different people orient to and relate to conflict.
Can I ask a question quick?
Yes.
About that? So, I read something or heard something recently that made me think, and that was that it's not a conflict unless both people understand that it's a conflict. And so you might be feeling it, right? You might be feeling like this person is, just being a jerk or whatever it is that you're thinking. But if they don't know that you're having a reaction to the way they're handling the situation, then it's not really, it's not that it's not a conflict, but it doesn't, if both people don't understand that it's a conflict, it's hard to actually work through it without going back to your own, your maybe unhealthy patterns of in relationship with conflict. Just I don't know if you could comment on that.
It probably makes sense technically, and also it's if I feel conflict with you and you're not in conflict with me, I'm probably not in conflict with you, I'm in conflict with the you that exists in my head, is what I might imagine.
Exactly, yeah.
Now, for some reason, we have a quote here from Jen. I don't know if Jen's on the call, but Jen Hamady wrote a couple of terrific books. One of them is The Art of Singing. And she talks about how FDR in the Depression, in his inaugural speech, talked about the only thing we have to fear is fear itself, that kind of paralyzing fear, etc. And Jennifer reframed that as, well, I would suggest that the only thing we have to fear is an unhealthy relationship with fear. And I found that really helpful. And she goes on in the book to talk about in performance, if you ever see someone perform who has no fear, it's probably an unenergetic and rather dull performance. And so really excellent performers use fear as a resource to bring energy and focus into their performance. So I think we're gonna, we'll have this exercise in the document, and it'll be better formatted than this. We're gonna pass on this right now, but this is a really interesting exercise to understand that often in conflict, when I feel conflict with another person, it can be about that other person and what that other person is doing. And it can also be, as we were just sharing, sorry, I didn't catch your name, but it can be conflict with that person who lives in my head. And so this exercise is a exercise from shadow work based on the work of Carl Jung about really identifying how that other person is showing up in our head and really telling us about repressed parts of ourselves. So we will share that exercise in the resources afterward. So what are situations or circumstances where we might get into unhealthy relationships with resistance? Again, you can offer in chat. Let's hear from a few people verbally. One of the things we've often seen is, particularly among organizational leaders, resistance is something to be fixed or solved or overcome. And the result of that is that we get more of what we're trying to stop. We often could get resistance when we're working from a real urgency. Urgency being in the work on white supremacy culture, a rather white dominant value. It frequently shows up in white dominant organizations. And so it's like, let's get this done. We need to get this done yesterday, et cetera. And any resistance becomes a roadblock on our path to doing things not just quickly, but perfectly. So we often see too that the impact on us of an unhealthy relationship with resistance is we suppress wisdom and experience, particularly in change initiatives. Like someone will say, didn't we do this 10 years ago and it didn't work? Because that person has been there 30 years and seen the same flavor of the month come and go 3 times. But in our urgency to get the change initiative done in an organization or in a collaboration, and our urgency to move forward to action will suppress that kind of learning and wisdom and experience. And of course, people become disenfranchised. Others?
So there's some really interesting comments in chat, Russ. Someone has said that resistance is external expression of internal fear. So drawing on the connection between a couple of the variables, that there's impact, the possibility of getting more resistance, that could be an impact on us. So resistance represents interest or fear. Kathleen says that she's feeling like resistance in the political sense can lead to transformation. And she clarifies that that's a US political perspective, for example.
Mm-hmm.
And
there's a cycle here too, right? We suppress resistance because we treat it as a bad thing or a barrier to what we want to achieve. People are disenfranchised and we get more resistance.
Yeah, and another impact that Ryan brought up is that if you will withdraw your own contribution to all forms of the situation.
Right. So many benefits to resistance. It can help us be more open and inclusive, less rigid. Well, I should say benefits of a healthy relationship with resistance. Help us differentiate our needs and experiences. Obviously, this is where we're understanding what the resistance is about. We're inquiring. We're open to learning and vulnerability. Maybe there's something we're doing that's creating the resistance. And so it might seem threatening, but if we're willing to be vulnerable, we can find the wisdom in the resistance.
Stuart says that resistance can also be a positive expression against one or more forms of oppression.
Mm-hmm.
That accepting and working with resistance can bring interesting results. That was another comment. And resistance is definitely my favorite. It's the least of the baddies.
Who was that?
Fran.
Yeah, it is interesting, right? Because in each of these things, if you're in a dysfunctional and oppressive system, resistance is the healthiest act. If you're in a system that's designed to not only oppress you, but to kill you, fear is a healthy response, right? So there's a lot of context here, right? And often what we're talking about is it's not about minimizing fear, minimizing conflict, minimizing resistance, just changing the way we relate to them.
Yes, exactly. And Joseph says that resistance is almost always a signal that something important has been missed in our work. It can also be a reflection of irreconcilable differences.
One of the resources I'll suggest here is the Battle Klein Battle Resistance Style Inventory. We've used this in our training, and it's a brief instrument that helps us understand our instinctive, just like we have preferred conflict modes, like I might prefer accommodation or avoidance over competition, for example. We also tend to have preferred resistance styles. So my resistance style might be introjection or deflection. Deflection meaning I'm just gonna kind of ignore that and act as if you didn't just say what you just said. Introjection being, I'm going to just take in what you've said as if it is the God-given truth, because you're such an authority and I'm such a peon in the system that you must be right. And so I'm going to take that in unquestioningly. So really excellent thing, both again to use individually and in groups.
Russ, are you going to share that model as part of the resources?
The resistance style inventory?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's in print. It's not online, but you can order it from Pat Battle and Associates.
Okay, thanks.
So Paulo Coelho says any resistance is not only normal, but necessary. It is a part of the creative process. So finally, we come to failure. What are the times when we develop an unhealthy relationship with failure? What are things that can get us into that unhealthy relationship with failure?
When failure consumes us, is coming up in chat.
Whoever posted that, would you mind sharing a bit more about what you mean?
Sure. It's really the first thing I thought about when I thought about failure. It's an emotion that really consumes us and paralyzes us, and we continue to be stuck in kind of this space where we're not moving forward, right? We're just thinking about what can happen, and we talk about these baddies, and really paralyzed in just one space without moving forward, and it really consumes us. And I've experienced that in my work as well. And I try to practice failing fast, right? Not just failing will happen, but failing fast. Let's move forward, right? Out of that space and in motion into progress.
Thanks. What was your name, by the way?
Louis.
Louis. Thanks, Louis. So others, we'll get into an unhealthy relationship when, with failure, when.
I was going to say, I think for me, it's debilitating because it stopped me from progressing, because I'm, being afraid of that failure, that incompetency.
Mm-hmm.
When we allow it to define us.
Thanks, Ron. Yeah. There's also another thing we've seen, which is when we overlearn lessons from the past. And so it's like, I'm not going to go near that again because last time I did that, it blew up in my face.
Trauma.
Trauma. Say more about that.
Well, it seemed like it was a traumatic, experience for you. And of course, we don't want to re-traumatize ourselves. And many times we do it without knowing and hurting ourselves in that way. So that's kind of what I thought when you mentioned that.
Yeah. And so the impact of an unhealthy relationship with failure, when we're in an unhealthy relationship with this thing we call failure, what starts to happen? What do we start to see?
There's some comments in chat. It stops me from starting.
That's poetic.
When fear of failure stops one from action, we stick to the familiar and then the same things we're comfortable with. We don't show up. We can't find the lesson or understand why the failure occurred. Not speaking up. We will never take a risk. We assume that this is the final moment.
And that last one is interesting because it can be both a cause an unhealthy relationship with failure and be an effect. Can you say it again, Melissa?
Oh, yes, this scrolling so quickly. Let me go back up.
Okay, and I think someone else is going to share here too.
Yeah, go ahead. Oh, we assume that this is the final moment.
This is Carrie again. I think one of the things that's coming up for me is the challenge that I'm having with defining these words around this is happens when and the impact on us. There's a value in that. And at the same time, you know, I feel like as a woman who was raised in, a white woman raised in the white dominant patriarchal sort of society, I was raised in the culture of sort of the Nike phrase of just do it. And if you took your time and didn't move in the dominant culture, sort of common characteristics of a sense of urgency or a sense of perfection or a sense of linear and documented work, then there was failure around it. And so I think it's important to remind ourselves that these concepts are not kind of one size fits all when we define the word, that my experience with failure as a woman was about kind of unlearning the sort of patriarchal culture that I tend to exist in, that I am trying to lead adaptively within. And so I feel like we turned failure, resistance, and conflict into these internal struggles when the truth is that we actually might be just fine, and that it's our external environment that is impacting us to create this emotional response. And sometimes acknowledging the external environment actually validates that who we are authentic and meaningful as we are in that moment, and that there is no need to change or respond or to be impacted. That really the first thing that we can do is recognize that existing as a woman in a patriarchal way of being is a challenge, and it's not on me to have to navigate that. That's on the system changing so that it's a safer place and a more authentic place for me to exist. So
yeah.
I kind of go back and forth in the sort of interpersonal relationship. We have these emotions, and the fact that we have these emotions because of the societal values and systems within where we exist, and we need to call those out as a way of finding safety.
Yeah. So I'm hearing there's beware of the internalization at one level.
Sometimes I'm just in a male fucking culture, and they're not allowing me the space to talk, and I don't have resistance to it. There's resistance to me. There's failure I have, but it's the situation that I'm in that is not setting me up. It's not who I am, and it's other people's space to create that place to be more equitable and meaning for everyone.
Yeah. And I think the other thing I was hearing there, Carrie, to put it in a phrase, is being conscious about differentiating between systemic failure or system failure and something that might genuinely have been my failure or my team's or whatever, right? So here are some benefits, again, from the harvesting. And Carrie's note here, a benefit might be, we've learned more about the dysfunction of the larger systems that we're a part of. So that would be a good one to add here. So some practices. I was suggesting here that all the practices around fear can apply here. And these aren't, none of these is a one size fits all kind of practice here. But one of the things we do often in our work is the idea of low cost, lo-fi prototyping, kind of an agile approach where we're just trying things with minimal risk and kind of failing early. Failing being a very positive thing in design thinking and human-centered design. And it's really a learning activity. We also put version numbers on things. So we say this is the working goal for our work together, version 1. Another big one is we often talk about just being good enough and avoiding this tendency of collaborations to try to get the perfect analysis or the perfect strategy that's going to answer all our questions and solve all the problems, which isn't even possible. And so we'll often, even as facilitators, we'll just say, all right, good enough. Because if you ask if things are good or everyone is satisfied, you'll never get into that healthy relationship with failure. So from my Angelou here, you may encounter many defeats, but you must not be defeated. In fact, it may be necessary to encounter the defeats so you can know who you are, what you can rise from, and how you can still come out of it. So these are some themes. I won't kind of go through these here, but I'm just wondering if there are any of these that stand out to folks that folks would like to reflect on or maybe add to. One interesting thing is on number 2, resistance is really about boundary management. Sometimes resistance is necessary to get other actors in the system to redraw their boundaries. So resistance is, hey, company, you're not taking responsibility for the full impacts of what you're doing. The harm that your product is having on workers, for example. And so our resistance is to get them to redraw their boundaries of accountability to society, for example. So that's, again, kind of along the lines of what Carrie is sharing, not thinking of resistance as it's me managing my boundaries, but it's me resisting the way the boundaries are drawn in the system. Okay. So one of the themes, as I've been collecting these and reflecting on my relationship with particularly fear and conflict, is from Taoism and Buddhism. This is alternatively called a Taoist or Buddhist story. But it comes from China, and it's about a farmer who had saved enough money to buy a horse, and his neighbor said, "You're so lucky, you have a horse to pull your wagon." And the farmer replies to his neighbors, "Maybe." And one day he forgot to lock the gate and his horse ran away. This is just not long after he had paid all that money for that horse. And his neighbors were upset and said, "Oh no, that's terrible, very bad luck." And the farmer again replied, "Maybe." And a few days later, the horse returned and brought with it a wild horse. So now this farmer has 2 horses, and the neighbors are kind of jealous, but they say, "How wonderful, you're very lucky." And the farmer again says, "Maybe." Next week, the farmer's son is breaking in the wild horse, and it threw him off. He lands on the ground, he breaks his leg, and the neighbors, of course, commiserate with him, or think they commiserate with him. "Very bad luck." And the farmer again replies, "Maybe." The next day, the farmer sees that the soldiers of the emperor have come into the village, and they're conscripting all the young men in their village to go fight in a war, a faraway war. But because of his broken leg, the farmer's son is left behind. And so, of course, the neighbors all say, "You're very lucky." And they're particularly upset because their children were taken away to fight in the war. You can imagine what the farmer's response was. "Maybe." So again, as with any story or lesson, we don't want to overlearn from it. But the idea of equanimity is a broader view on experience, and that in Taoism, nothing is entirely negative or positive, that there's yin and yang in everything. So even an experience of intense fear, there's the presence of courage. Even in the midst of a crisis, opportunity is present. Even in the midst of resistance, love and mutual respect and collaboration can exist and do exist at some level. So from Hamlet, there's nothing either good or bad, but thinking makes it so. So that's probably part of the story. One of the things that I've been looking at is on some of the practices that relate to these individual experiences like fear and conflict. What are the practices that seem to be helpful across all the experiences? And one of the big ones, and one that Bob talks about, is, and Bob, maybe you can share your story about COVID-19 in a minute, but moving toward the feeling, not away, and allowing it to become fully present. This is very much a practice in Gestalt where it's called fattening the figure being whatever that thing is that's present. Let's bring it fully into our awareness. And so if even if it's not one of these, if it's anger, bring that anger fully into my awareness so that I can fully understand it and not try to repress it or shunt it away. Are there any other practices that folks have that you'd like to share with the group or put in the chat?
This is related to counting to 10 or slowly breathing. If you're not able to do that on your own, but you still need to buy yourself a little time, try to keep a water bottle with you at all times. It'll just look like you're thinking, if you're with another person and you're in conflict or whatever, it'll just look like you're taking a moment to take a drink of water and thinking. But it gives your brain a little time to react or to not react.
So the water bottle strategy. All right, any others? Bob, if you're on,
yeah,
I'd love to hear the brief, kind of what you did around the white knuckle fear.
I was having frightening, vivid dreams, and I a couple of times woke up at the edge of my bed, punching in the air and screaming, and I would wake up with a sense that I hadn't slept at all. And so that was, I realized it was my body's trying to protect me from this thing, this coronavirus. So I thought about that and I said, what can I do? What can shift? And so pushing and fighting this invisible force away was not successful. So I said, well, the thing that's divine about human beings is they can shift their point of view and give something a voice that before was silent and threatening. So I decided to cop out and join the coronavirus in the sense that I gave her a name. It was a her in my imagination, right? And she suddenly started to speak to me, and her name was Cora. And she said, "Why are you so surprised this is happening? Do you know how many birds have died? Billions in the last 50 years, and the insects and the bees and all of these things are how about the oil spills?" And on and on. And she said, "And you're surprised, Bob? Really?" And so it became, it lost, and I had this rage or this anger about this is not, this planet is, I can't, you know, you can't screw around. You know, there's going to be consequences. And there was something that I wasn't aware of that became vocal, and I could hear that voice. So I started to write something, Cora's Chronicles. And I'm still working on it. I'm not sure.
And you'll share it? You'll share it?
Well, if, okay. That's a, let me think, could be, maybe.
All right.
But if I do, I definitely, I'll send it to you and you can tell me whether, you know, what you think and, you know, anyways, but that's.
Thank you, Bob.
Your point of view. That's the wonderful thing about all of us being storytellers.
Thank you, Bob. All right, so that was a lot to cover in a webinar. Thanks for chewing on it with us and contributing. There's a lot of rich content for us to share here. I noticed in the chat there are a lot of comments, some from Ron, Deb, Sally on meditation. That's probably helpful with these 4 experiences and so much more. And so highly encouraged. But thank you everyone for joining, and look for the resources. And if you have any other suggestions for topics or webinars that we might experiment with, please let us know.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. It's great.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone, especially Co-Creative.
Good Thanks, stuff. Everyone.
Thank you, Russ. Thanks, everyone.
Oh, my nephew enjoyed this. Bye, guy.
Hey, Russ.